the Christian tradition, while it does place the primacy of gift and receptivity and thanksgiving for existence at the top kind of the totem pole, it doesn't discount the importance of work, right? It doesn't say that work is and producing and creating things is therefore unimportant. And I think that's kind of the question we're going to try to answer. So how should we understand this relationship in our lives in a theoretical way, but then in a very practical way? Like how are we going to try to live this out in a day-to-day way, this relationship between work and leisure? You thought that it would be wise to frame the conversation within the larger context of what you called the exitus reditus.
Which comes from St. Thomas Aquinas.
No, it's totally Matt.
It's your origin. My bad.
He made it up.
Sorry.
So the idea of exitus and reditus, the idea that God creates the world and then man, as the final act of creation, is then to bring all of that creation back to God.
The kind of cycle goes, God the Father creates the world. Then we have, like we would say, the Old Testament, the prophets, right? And then comes who? Jesus Christ, the God-man, right? And what does he institute? He institutes the church and the sacraments as patterns back to the Father, right? So how do we enter? So exitus, the creation comes from God. Reditus, we return to God in the name of Jesus Christ. So that's kind of more or less the structure there.
Even in the garden, the idea was
Correct.
that creation was supposed to be something that Adam then returns back to the Father. Like that was his act of worship in naming and ordering. And so that exitus and reditus was already there.
St. Thomas Aquinas, his entire Summa Theologia is patterned after this pattern. He says that God is the first origin of all things. Mm-hmm. Everything comes forth from God. But that God is also the final end of all things. Like that not only human beings, but in a sense, all of creation has an end, has a telos or a telos is the Greek word for end, that is it's like the purpose for which it existed. It's the end towards which it is always moving, and ultimately it is for creation to glorify and ultimately return back to God in an act of gratitude and love and thanksgiving for the gift of itself. And so that concept is very profound and it's very beautiful. And I think it does. I think, Matt, you're right. It does help us understand. It helps us situate this discussion about work and leisure, because in the Garden of Eden, when God created humanity, you said this was already at play. Adam and Eve's job, like their vocation, was to
cultivate the earth,
facilitate this reditus, right? Like be instruments in the highest instruments, right? Because they're part of the material creation, but they're also spiritual beings, and so they can take the material creation and with their freedom and creativity offer it back to God the Father, right?
But there wasn't a tension between work and leisure. There wasn't two kind of duplicitous or fragmented worldviews.
Yeah, let's try to understand that the relationship between work and leisure in the garden. What would we say about that?
It seems like they were one and the same, right? Because if leisure is how does Pieper describe it? He says that leisure is to time what the temple is to space. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so the temple or the church is the place that is set apart for worshiping God, right? So it's made holy, right? It's separate.
That's right.
So that we can return back to God. It's the place where that happens, where God meets humanity and we ascend the mountain, however you want to frame it. And so prior to the fall, there was no place where God wasn't.
Yeah.
And so that temple was creation.
Yeah, there was no temple. The temple was creation itself.
So that means any act of work, any act of return was worship. They were completely synthesized.
Which is, it's kind of a radical concept. And I think this is the first step towards understanding the role of work in our own lives. It's to recognize, that work existed in the Garden of Eden, right? Like even Adam and Eve in paradise, it wasn't like they just had their feet up and were relaxing and like reading all day, right? They were actually
Cultivating the
earth,
yeah.
till and keep the earth. This is what God commanded them to do. But they were doing it, as Matt, you just said, in such a way that it was, that all of it was an act of love and worship and thanksgiving to God, even in and through their work, in such a way it wasn't yet the toil and the drudgery that work is now after the fall, right?
Yeah.
It was an expression of their love for the Father and a means by which they offered their lives and all of creation back to Him by like ordering it and making it beautiful.
And just to define leisure again for those who are unfamiliar, I think it'd be helpful. Leisure here we're talking about, Joseph Pieper characterizes it as a disposition of the soul that is ready to embrace reality, right? So this relationship between work and leisure in Adam and Eve, they had a disposition of the soul. They were moved by grace, right? To take the created order and offer it to God. And as you're pointing out, and I really like your point about this when we talked the other day, Matt, like all of that changed after the fall. Like work was, food was earned by the sweat of the brow after the fall, right? The pains of labor, the work of the woman to bring a child into the earth was painful and was work after the fall. Right. So elaborate on this whole kind of, right, at the beginning of creation, we had leisure and work, let's say, integrated.
United.
Right? And then after the fall, there's the splitting of this, which is what we're experiencing still today. Even in our little podcast platform, we see this tension arise.
I think one of the ways we can kind of step aside from this talk of leisure, but as thinking of leisure as worship, we can kind of paint a little bit more of the picture.
Yeah.
In that, let's say, post-fall, everything we do is ordered towards something.
Yeah.
Right? Everything is a ready-to towards something, and you can call it a lower God or a higher God, right? So there's this hierarchy of things and ideals that we strive for, things that we do because of a particular goal. Those are all little ready-to's to some sort of thing, right? So I'll give you an example. This is something that
can we coin that term, ready-to's? I like that.
Yes, I like to make adjectives and plurals of everything that's not supposed to be, but but so this came up in discussion with my wife. We were talking about eating at the table and the meal times, and I said there is a way that you can just see how we come together for lunch, breakfast, dinner, etc., as just means of sustenance.
Yep.
Right? Like I'm just here to get some food so I can go back to my work. Right? I'm here to grab a quick bite or whatever, and then I got to go do the real.
Yeah, I'm gonna go
thing,
heat up the cold Chipotle because I got to go back in the studio.
Exactly. And so that action, right, of eating lunch is a type of ready-to's, right, to the God of sustenance. Let's just this is kind of a poetic painting of this. Okay. Now, so I posed the question. I said, when we gather for a meal, is there a way that we can gather for a higher ideal, right? Like a higher God, if you will. Obviously, it's going to be God Himself, but it's like, is there something like community or relationship with the other people at the table that we actually are gathering here for? And the work that we do leads to these moments and not the other way around. Right? And so this is now a reordering of the things I do, the work post-fall, so that it's properly aligned with the highest ideal, right? So this is now I'm bringing that work that could be outside, that could be disordered because it's for just a lower ideal. I'm now bringing that into a higher mode of being, right? And this is to Pieper's point, this leisure disposition will inform how I then treat lunch, for example.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really good. So so St. Thomas Aquinas will say that human beings, we act for the sake of an end, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is another way of saying exactly what you just said. We all have these little ready-to's. These are the ends for which we act, and we act for multiple ends at a time. So like you were saying, I can, why do I get up out of bed in the morning?
Yeah.
Well, the immediate end is because I need to like start my day. I need to start.
I gotta get to work.
I got to get to work.
Yeah.
But then like, okay, that's subordinated to a higher end of why do I need to get to work on time? Well, because I need to keep my job and I need to work hard and make money to feed my family. And of course, that's subordinated to a higher end that we have of ultimately, you know, being able to enjoy my life, have resources, you know, maybe have some time for recreation. And ultimately, the highest end that we're all seeking is happiness, right?
Well, and then God, right? So like that's the structure. It's like
Ideally.
exactly. So and this is your point though, right, Matt? So like, where are our structure of ideals? And is at the top God?
And before the fall, God was at the top.
Correct.
So before the fall, everything that Adam and Eve did, all of the little ends that they were pursuing were perfectly subordinated to and oriented towards their ultimate end, which was God. And which is why leisure and work or worship and work were almost completely one in them, because everything they were doing, even their small act of eating a meal together, was ultimately oriented towards, yes, their sustenance, yes, their community life, but ultimately towards the glorification of God, ultimately towards facilitating that reditus.
Yeah.
But then after the fall, they're cut off from God, right? There's now a divide between them and God, and they have a false
And them in themselves.
and them in themselves, right? So they're disordered within themselves, but they also are cut off from what is highest. And so what they start putting at the top, towards which they're orienting their little redituses, right, is something that's not God.
Yeah.
It's some created good that is less than what will ultimately satisfy them.
Yeah, and touch in on this. I know the other day when we were talking, you brought up something kind of in passing, but I found it particularly profound. You said that also one of the effects of the fall is losing our identity as a child of God, right? And I bring this up because in the first notation of the rule of Saint Benedict, right? Which I don't know. You know Saint Benedict?
I've heard of it.
You heard of the guy Saint Benedict before? You heard of the guy? There we go. Saint Benedict. He starts off by saying, "Listen, O son, to the words of your master." Right. So, because why? Well, he does that. This is a 5th and 6th century saint we're talking about, who's leading these group of men who are, by the way, focused around, their life is focused around work and prayer. We could say work and a form of leisure, right? Because he's trying to instantiate in that group of men that their role in the ordered world is to actually first reclaim their identity as beloved children of God, who are to take the created world, enter into it, into the dynamic of its difficulty even, so as to be able to enter it into the leisureful life that they live in their work, but also their scheduled prayer, their scheduled time of dinners, right? Their scheduled time of masses. Because it's like you said, there's this idea, this view that as a beloved child of God, I am called to enter into his life. And entering into his life is one that, yes, as we were talking about, God creates, he works, right? But then on the 7th day, he also rests, right?
Right.
So entering into that
Yeah.
integrated life.